Well, hello and welcome to our second edition of the Alan Hudson podcast. For those that saw the first edition, you may recall that we celebrated the 50th anniversary of Chelsea's first ever FA Cup win in 1970. Today we're going to move on to the season following, seasons 1970-71. As you can see, Alan's joined us. Alan, how are you? You're well?
Yeah, I'm all right, mate. I'm coping. Looking forward to doing this one with you. We've changed it a bit, haven't we? We were going to do the Cup Winners' Cup. I think I like talking about George, actually. I think he gets... when he left us, George, he got some really bad publicity, which I didn't like. He was a great fella, and he was the best player we've seen in our lifetime on these shows. So I think it'd be great in these times to remember him.
Okay. Well, just to let everyone know, what we're planning to talk about is the great George Best. We're at the 1970-71 season. And Alan, looking back at those times, I mean, that must just have been a great era to be a footballer playing for Chelsea.
Well, I think it was a great era of playing football for anyone, Tom, because I remember getting into the side and there, what people tend to forget, the new generation tend to forget, it was all British in them days. There's no foreigners, no overseas players. They come to save us, having said that, in the 80s. But in these days, I spoke to Tony Curry the other day. We have players like Tony at Sheffield, Charlie Joy, all over the place. Every team had a great player, even down to Huddersfield with Frank Worthington. They were great days, Tony, weren't they? And of course, we had George Best.
Yeah, the greatest of them all in terms of British players, and many would say in terms of world footballers.
Yeah, I mean, I think in around that time, even Pele called him the greatest player in the world. I think Pele see him playing, and he said he was the greatest player in the world. In those times, I was lucky enough. In my first season in 1970, I played against George, Johan Cruyff and Pele in about 6 months, which was, I don't think anyone's got that on their CV. To play against the three greatest players in the world in 6 months, to be on the same field as them three was quite something, and I think I played pretty well against George with Manchester United, but I don't think I got a touch. I was too busy watching Johan and the great Pele when I played against them.
Tell us a bit about the circumstances in which you played against Pele and Johan Cruyff.
Well, in 1970, we were invited to play against Santos, and we played them over in a friendly in Jamaica. And I reckon it was a record attendance. I don't think it was big. It's only an island, isn't it? But I remember they were up the trees and everything. You couldn't get near the ground. And years and years later, it was great because although the highlight of the night was me, Johnny Boyle, and Tommy Baldwin standing at the bar with him about 3 in the morning. He had a blonde on one hand, on one arm, and a drink in the other, and we thought, he should be with us, playing for Chelsea. And he was a great fella. It was so that kind of was a great feeling for me because it kind of taught me to always keep your feet on the floor because he was just an ordinary bloke. Nothing, no ego. Some of these players today, I can't stand, and managers with their ego can't stand. But it was great playing against him and having a drink with him after. And of course, in that game, John Barnes was one of the ball boys, which he told me years later. And I'd love him to have come to Chelsea. As for Johan, I played against him at the end of the season after I'd done my ankle. We went on the pre-season tour for the next season. We played in France against or something. I remember coming back. We stopped in Amsterdam to play a team called Ajax, and we was all joking on the airplane, saying, they're a cleaning firm and all this, all the jokes were coming out, not knowing that they were going to go on to be the best team in Europe and play total football. And of course, Johan played, and I was limping about. I was terrible. But we'd find the night before we found Heineken in this bar. I'll never forget that. And the boys had a good drink, thinking we were playing like a pub team. And out they come, and you know, we say George was the greatest player on the planet, but Johan would have something to say about that. Excuse me.
So, had you heard of Johan Cruyff before turning up in Amsterdam for that game?
No, I didn't know who he was when he come on the field, and I thought he can't be any good because he got number 14 on his back. He must be one of the subs, you know, and that was his number, wasn't it? So he must have known he was going to go on to be the greatest player in the world. You know, to change the number shirt like that was it was something, wasn't it? It was significant. You know, I couldn't play unless I had a number 10 on. You know, you get this thing about shirts. I was all right in a number 8. I went to Seattle and played with number 4. It was more of a quarterback role, but the number 10 was the shirt, the Johnny Haynes shirt, the Puskas shirt, Great Suarez, the era in Italy, all these great players. George Easton, Arsenal was at Stoke before me. You had to have the number 10 shirt, but Johan went to the next level and brought 14 in. And I used to wear 14 in testimonials after that, thinking I was him, but it never worked out.
How long was it into the match before you realised that this guy was about to make a sensational impact on the game?
Immediately. He just took over from the kickoff. I remember seeing this fellow who didn't really look like a footballer. He didn't have the right stamp. He was tall for that kind of play. He wasn't a front man, which if he'd have been a centre forward, you'd thought he's a gangly centre forward, but he wasn't. He played all over the field. He moved about the field a lot, and it was just mesmerising. And we were going to talk about the Winners' Cup, and the greatest player I've seen like that since would have been Robbie Rensenbrink, but Cruyff was on a different level. He was. I think he was the greatest player of all time that I've ever been on the pitch with and seen.
Oh right, so you put Cruyff above George Best.
Well, I have this thing where I kind of judge players for how they played against me when I played against them. George, funnily enough, never really played well against our Chelsea team. It was just I don't know what it was, and I didn't play in the match when he scored the goal at Old Trafford in the League Cup, which was one of the greatest goals of all time. That'd have been a World Cup match. And people say, well, it weren't the World Cup, it was League Cup. But the World Cup never had anyone tougher than Ron Harris. No World Cup has ever seen a player like Ron Harris, thank God. You know, but that's the way it is. And he tried to kick. I always say, if he'd have caught George, he'd have ended up in Manchester High Street. He really would have. But and George buckled. You see him buckle, but the way he kept his balance and composure. Peter Bonetti come out. He was the second best goalie behind Banks at that time. Went to the World Cup that year. He danced around Peter. Marvin hit and run back on the line, and I remember it being a mud. Whole goal to aim at George, and Marvin closed his legs as much as say, "You're not going to finish this by mugging me off," and George just tucked it in the corner, and he fell on his knees and looked into the sky, didn't he? But that's how great. You know, not many players can do that, if any.
And am I right in thinking, round about that era, you developed quite a close relationship, quite a close friendship with George?
I did. It was quite strange. I think there was a lot. I was a lot in the press in 1970, but for all the same kind of reasons as George. And I think they were looking for someone down south I had the long hair, and I was up in the King's Road where, you know, I was up and coming. I'd lived in the place where they were looking for this new George Best. The King's Road was the place to be. I was up and coming. Ramsey had just made the big statement about me, that no limit to what I could achieve. I got picked in the World Cup, so I was the up and coming thing. And I think George kind of, when I met George, he kind of looked at me and he liked me. We were two ordinary lads, and we got on great. There was no, even to the day that I was the first one up in hospital when he fell ill. He wouldn't let anyone else in, but he see me that day, and I don't sound proud of it because it was a very sad day for me. But I loved him. I loved him as a footballer. I loved him as a bloke. And Don Shanks don't like me for saying that because he nicked Miss World off him, Mary Stavitt. So he said to me the other day, don't go on about George too much. But what can you do? He was a friend of mine.
And we all know what George was like on the pitch. I mean, the tales are legendary in terms of what he could do with the football. But what was he like off the pitch? What was he like as a man?
George was, if you walked into the pub, you wouldn't know he was there. I walked into a pub in Sloane Square, which was my local Duke of Wellington one day, and he started to frequent it when he moved down. And he just sitting in the corner doing a crossword. And he just lifted his head from the crossword, looked over and said, "Hi, Al." Didn't send me a drink over, never did. But he didn't have to, I knew the barman, Eddie, and we just used to talk to each other. But it was strange, Tony, because I think all the time I knew him in those 30, 40 years, we never once mentioned the game. We never spoke about it, whether it was in his club in Manchester, in his club in up in the West End, in the Big Easy in Chelsea, wherever we met, in the Feeney, his local, or in the Duke of Wellington. We never once talked about football or footballers. It was just, we had a great respect for one another. I never had his phone number. He never had mine. And he lived about 200 yards from where I'm sitting now. So, we had this, I think it's great. We had a great respect for one another.
And he, as you say, he spent a lot of time in the West End and living in the Fulham, Chelsea area. I know you've told me in the past that you thought that he had a bit of a burning ambition to play for Chelsea.
I think it was more than that. I think I truly thought, in the modern game, I think he would have played for Chelsea. He would have, because he could have took over and said, "Look, I'm going to go there," and they would have done a deal because the money's so huge today. But in them days, there was too much. Football clubs were like pub teams in my day. They were, the people that ran it weren't capable. They didn't know how to do business. So George was kind of stuck in a catch-22. He was at Manchester United. He was the youngest player in the '68. Well, Brian Kidd and John Aston were there, but George was the kiddie of that team. He won them the cup in the M5. What he done in Portugal against Benfica. Dennis was getting too old. Bobby was getting too old. Paddy Kerr and Billy Fox. They were all getting too old, and George was left to carry that team on his own, and it was impossible. They started bringing in managers incapable of doing the job, incapable of managing this genius, even to the extent of him playing for Northern Ireland when Terry Neal was manager. Now, Terry Neal couldn't manage me, so if he couldn't manage me, he's not going to manage George Best. So he was really in a catch-22, and I've always said if Waddington would had a chance of signing, Waddington would have left no stone unturned to get his signature, because he knew that he was not only the greatest player in the world and the greatest asset, he knew that they come from all over the world to watch him play. That for me is great management.
Did George actually talk to you about signing for Chelsea?
He hinted very strongly. He couldn't really say it, and he couldn't say it in the press. He couldn't ask for it, and he never once asked for a transfer. I know that. His way of answering for a transfer was disappearing to Spain with a blonde. That was his answer to all his critics, and he didn't care. He didn't care what people thought about him, George. I think he'd had enough of football. I think he retired when he was 24. I mean, I was just coming into my best when I was 24. I was just finding my best form. He'd already been there and done it, and I think the other thing with George, which people never touch on, is I always knew about George that every 4 years it broke his heart that he couldn't go to a World Cup and play on the biggest because he was Northern Ireland, and they didn't have a team worthy of getting there. And they had probably the best goalkeeper in the world at that time, Pat Jennings, and the best player in the world, George. And the other 9 were average players, with the greatest respect. And George was choked every 4 years. And I think that didn't help his cause. And I think it was a lot to do, I'm not making an excuse for his drinking, but I think he would run away and, get tucked into the other side of life because he wanted to show the whole world. I bet that he never watched the World Cup when it come on every 4 years. I bet he never see one match. He would have broke his heart. Him not being there. How can you watch that and not want to slit your wrist? He was the greatest player at that time, and he wanted to show these people. And he see inferior players on television playing in a World Cup.
Can you imagine, though, if he'd have turned up at Chelsea and played in a blue shirt alongside you, Peter Osgood, Charlie Cook? You probably would have needed 4 balls, wouldn't you, on a Saturday afternoon?
Well, I was going to do a meatloaf there. He took the words right out of my mouth, Tone. Absolutely, there would have been a problem. It wouldn't have been so much. Me and Ozzy wouldn't have been a problem because I would have just. It'd have been a dream for me playing on the same field as Charlie and on one side, and poor old Peter Houseman would have had to stand down to make way for George. But it would have been a great forward line. We'd had everything in that forward line from Charlie, myself, Osgood, the fantastic Ian Hutchinson and obviously George. But he would have won us the league hands down. Where he was, he would have lifted our team to another level. And we most certainly then, we had enough trouble with the board at the time and the manager, but we would have had a bigger problem because we'd have needed a bigger ground. We would have needed 100,000 people, Peter, at Stamford Bridge. They would, these Norwegians and Swedish come over to watch football now, but they would have come over, 1,000 times more. All of them, they've all been in this country to see George Best play at Chelsea. And we see him in a Chelsea shirt one night, didn't we, with a famous picture. In fact, it's their time.
Just raise it a bit, Alan. There you go. Tell us a bit about that night then. What were the circumstances surrounding that game?
Well, I can't remember the game at all. I came down from Stoke to play in Peter Osgood's testimonial. He spoke to George, and George agreed to play, and I think that was another hint. But I think it was too late then because Dave Sexton had split the team up. Ozzy was, I don't know if Ozzy was playing back at the Bridge or no, he would have been at Southampton. I don't know. I don't know behind this, but it was his testimony. I remember coming back from Stoke, and it was. You can see that we kind of looked stunned in that photograph that there's the three of us in, and we knew that George wanted to play for us. He, as I say, he hinted several times when we used to go into Slack Alice and sit round and talk. But as I say, he wasn't comfortable talking about football. But we did know, and it all came to fruition really later on when he moved down to the King's Road, and that was his final resting place, wasn't it?
What was it? Looking back at his footballing career, what do you think his greatest asset was as a player?
That's a very, very tough question because I think George, especially being the size he was, he believed he could do anything. He scored great. I see him score a goal at White Hart Lane. I mean, he was the bravest of players as well. All them kind of players were the bravest players because they knew they were going to get kicked. Like Lionel Messi today, he's forever getting whacked. you know, but he had everything. He had every asset there was to be a. He was. I call people like George and Johan Cruyff freaks because they're for any coach because they can't be coached. You can't. How can you tell them what to do? They're on a different planet from any coach and every manager, and that's why they're hard to handle. Uh, and Busby knew that he couldn't be coached, and he just let him get on with it. Let George be George. He was a phenomenon really in our era.
The modern day greats are commonly known to be Messi and Ronaldo. How would you compare Messi and Ronaldo to the greats of the 70s, the Pele's, Johan Cruyff's, the George Best?
Well, when you look at Ronaldo, take Ronaldo for instance. Ronaldo, and I've listened to and read all about him from the Manchester United players. He was an unbelievable player, and the way Ferguson bought him, he was an unbelievable player. But he needed that gymnasium. He needed the bodybuilding. He needed everything. He needed to work to get where he's got, and he's become another phenomenon in our age. And his bank balance shows you that. But he worked on his game. But while he was doing that, George was out gallivanting with Miss World, and then turning up on a Saturday at 2:45, 20 to 3, and then mesmerising people. It was a very, very different game under very different circumstances. And if the coach tried to do that with George Best to get him into a gymnasium to build himself up, George Best would have disappeared. George was it's like a great actor. They come along, like an Al Pacino, Robert De Niro. They come along and Jack Nicholson, who used to drink with George, these people come along we've never seen a British George Best, have we? The closest this country's ever gone mad is probably a Gascoigne, when Gascoigne come in, but he did it every now and then, and he went off the rails in a different way from George. But George couldn't. He was incomparable. George, there was nothing like him. And what I've always found with great people, and I know a lot of great people from Phil Collins and people like in music, and the greater they are at what they do, the greater they are off the field. They're just so wonderful of people. They got no egos, and that's what I loved about George. He had time for everyone. He was, and my friend, he used to drink in a Feeney with him, and he told me a story about one day George went up and see his friend in the hospital without telling him, when he wasn't very well, and he'd do things without you knowing, absolutely terrific. He was just a lovely man. But you would never read about that. You'd just read about the other side of him. It tells newspapers, yeah.
You're talking about the British influence there. Are there any British players today that come close to George in terms of playing style?
No. I think the days of George Best are gone. I think the days of my type of player, as I said, I spoke to Tony Curry the other day. We'll never see another Tony Curry. We'll never see another Charlie George at Arsenal. These are English players that they just come along from school. This is when we could play in the streets that they can't do now. And all these players have been coached from a young age, and all this great talent that they were born with will be coached out of them. We don't see anyone, even to the extent Liverpool are 25 points better than everybody else this season, but in midfield, they haven't got a creative player. It's incredible how the game has changed. Now, years ago, you had to have a great inside forward. You had to have a creative midfield player. But this year, Jurgen Klopp has turned the game round, and he said, look, we've got the 3 best strikers in the world in his eyes. They're the quickest. They do things that no other strikers do. They play off the cuff, and they depend on them three strikers. And they don't play any football in midfield. They just pass the ball, do everything simple, and then get it into them three. So no, there's not going to be any George Best. There's it's in George Best. It's instinct. It's gone now, sadly. But I my feelings about the FA and the coaching badge and everything else. The hell out of that game, and I think it shows when they show the Mavericks. They'll never come back.
I know there's one English player out there right now that you've got a particular penchant for. You think he's a bit of a maverick, a modern day maverick, if you like, and he plays for Aston Villa.
Well, he's the closest thing that he's no George Best, but who is? And Jack Grealish, without a doubt, is the greatest player. And he not by. You've got to understand, he's only playing in a team that are fighting relegation, and to be doing the things he does in a team like that, I just see him in one of the top clubs and playing in Europe and just taking the world by storm. He's a wonderful player. He's so creative. I suppose it reminded me a lot of me, just the way he goes about the game, because he come out, he just got his socks down. He invites people to kick him, which is great. My good friend who knows George Best, as I said, told me a year ago he's not strong enough. Well, if he's not strong enough, then Joe Frazier was a wimp, No, Jack is he won't. Don't going back to the George Best thing. Jack Grealish will not play 10 times for England. That's an absolute certainty. And people in 20, 30 years' time, if they're doing these podcasts, they'll go on to do something else. We'll talk about how did Jack Grealish only, especially in the Midlands, they'll be saying, why isn't this kid playing for England? And I don't understand why. The first time I see him, I thought, well, he's tailor-made for the European game and the big stage. He's a big match player. But I think the sad thing about this is he won't get the recognition he deserves. And it don't really bother him. He loves playing for Aston Villa. I'm surprised Frank Lampard has not. Maybe he has had a word with Abramovich and say, look, you got to sell your yacht. You got to buy this kid. I think he's that good, Tony. I truly believe. And I see him in a Liverpool shirt, I see him in a Manchester City shirt, I see him in another shirt abroad, maybe. He's tailor-made for the Spanish league. He's tailor-made for the Italian league, and he's tailor-made for someone like Chelsea. You, being a Chelsea supporter, know that is the kind of player that you need. You are lacking a creative, someone who will get the ball like Jack does and run at defenders, go past and play 1-2s around the box, not someone that just keeps passing the ball sideways.
Sadly, Alan, we've run out of time. I could talk to you all day about football and listen to your great footballing memories. And it's a real treat to hear about you and your relationship with George Best in particular.
Well, yeah, I mean, if he was alive today, bless him, I'd have made sure that he would have been locked down with me. He would have stayed in my flat. We'd have been locked down together because he was a gem of a man, and we miss him. I miss him like mad. And when I read about all these footballers talking about how good they are and see how much money they're earning, what George had to go through to get a few quid. He didn't want a nightclub. He didn't want to live that life, but he was forced into doing it because there was no money. But he was George Best. And you speak to Dennis Law about him or Bobby Charlton about him, Pat Crone about him, and they'll tell you the real story because they were out on the field with him every week. He was my friend.
Well, perfect note to end this podcast. Thanks again, Alan, for sharing your great football memories with us. And we're sure to do it again soon.
I hope so, Tone. Yes. Is that part 1 or part 2? Can we talk about George again?
We'll do. The next edition will be part 2 on George Best. Thanks again, Alan.